Hey guys, tonight we're traveling somewhere a little unpleasant. So grab some water, maybe fluff your pillow, and please be grateful for air conditioning, because we're going back to the Wild West. Now, the Wild West has this reputation of being exciting, glamorous, and filled with heroic cowboys and quick-draw duels. Hollywood has spent a century convincing us it was basically one big rodeo with guns. Clint Eastwood squinting at everyone, horses galloping dramatically across the desert, saloons with swinging doors where every drink looks perfectly poured. But, yeah, reality check. The Wild West was not glamorous at all. In fact, you listening right now, would not survive more than a single day out there. And I mean that quite literally. The place was like one long-running survival challenge, but with dysentery, really bad dentistry, and people shooting each other over who got to use the one shovel in town. So let's gently wander through this dusty, miserable landscape together. We're not going to rush. We're not going to sprint across the prairie. We're just going to take our time, calmly picking apart all the tiny details that made the Wild West not just deadly, but also extremely boring and inconvenient in ways movies never bother to mention. Think of this as your very slow, very sarcastic bedtime guide to why you would not want to time travel to 1870s Kansas. Let's start with the basics. The Wild West wasn't even that wild. For one, it wasn't endless chaos. There were laws, there were courts, there were sheriffs who mostly just looked tired and wrote a lot of paperwork. The average town had fewer shootouts than your local Walmart parking lot on Black Friday. But the real problem wasn't dramatic gunfights. It was that life was basically designed to kill you. Every part of your daily routine came with at least 3 new ways to die. Take food, for example. Do you like eating? Good. In the Wild West, you'd mostly get beans. Just beans. Sometimes with a side of sadness. Okay, fine. There was also bread, and if you were really lucky, salted pork. But pork back then was more salt than pig. Imagine chewing on a chunk of meat that's been sitting in a barrel of brine for 6 months. Not exactly 5-star dining. And if you wanted fresh vegetables, congratulations, you now live 400 miles from the nearest farm that isn't also currently being attacked by grasshoppers. Speaking of which, the Great Plains had these things called locust swarms. Picture clouds of bugs so thick they literally blocked out the sun, ate every green plant in sight, and occasionally nibbled on things like laundry, saddles, and even wooden tool handles. You, the new settler, would watch your crops disappear in about 15 minutes flat. Suddenly, those beans don't sound so bad, huh? But maybe you're thinking, okay, I'll just go hunting instead. Cute idea. Except the Wild West was not overflowing with deer waiting to hop onto your dinner plate. By the mid-1800s, settlers had already started wiping out wildlife in massive numbers. Buffalo went from millions roaming the plains to, hey, did anyone see the last one? In less than a generation. So you'd be out there with your little rifle, stomach growling, realizing the only thing left to shoot was a prairie dog, which, yes, technically you could eat, but it wasn't exactly something people bragged about. Dinner tonight, slightly stringy rodent with a hint of dirt flavor. Bon appetit. Oh, and let's not forget water. Clean water was basically a rumor. Wells often tasted like metal, dirt, or, if you were really unlucky, straight up arsenic. The nice thing about arsenic poisoning is it makes everything else seem less painful by comparison. Let's move on to hygiene. Because this is where the Wild West really separates itself from modern life. Remember how you brushed your teeth today? Yeah, That didn't exist out there. Toothbrushes were rare. Toothpaste was basically baking soda mixed with disappointment, and dentists, when you could find one, were closer to part-time blacksmiths with pliers. If you had a cavity, the solution was yank it out. No numbing, no Novocaine, just a chair, a large man, and a prayer. Bathing wasn't much better. Water was precious, and bathing regularly was seen as wasteful. People might wash their faces and hands, but full-body baths were usually once a week. Once a week. And even then, the whole family often shared the same tub of water. By the time the youngest kid got in, the water was basically soup. You do not want to be the youngest kid in that lineup. Smells? Oh yes, imagine a small wooden town in the middle of July. No air conditioning, no deodorant, no trash collection. Just layers of human, horse, and livestock aromas blending into what I'll politely call atmosphere. If you were born into it, maybe you got used to it. But if you were time traveling from the year 2025, you'd pass out instantly. Clothing wasn't much help either. Cowboys and settlers wore wool. Lots of wool. You know that itchy Christmas sweater you avoid? Now imagine wearing that while herding cattle in 100-degree heat. Boots were stiff, heavy, and designed more for surviving rattlesnakes than comfort. If you didn't get blisters, congratulations, you were probably already dead. And speaking of boots, there's this fun fact. Many Wild West towns had dirt streets, which quickly turned into mud whenever it rained. Combine that with horse manure everywhere, and you basically needed boots just to survive a casual walk to the saloon. Those stylish Hollywood shots of cowboys clinking spurs across town? Yeah, the real version was people sliding around in mud mixed with animal poop. Super glamorous. Now let's talk about healthcare. Spoiler, there wasn't much. Doctors existed, sure, but medical knowledge was basically try something and see if the patient screams. Germ theory was only just becoming a thing, and lots of doctors still thought infections came from bad air. So your treatment options included things like bleeding, blistering, or taking a nice dose of mercury. Fun side effect of mercury? It slowly poisons you. But at least your fever might go down first. Childbirth was especially dangerous. Maternal death rates were terrifying, and infant mortality was through the roof. Families often had 8 or 10 kids just to make sure at least a few survived to adulthood. And if you were the child who survived, congratulations, you now get to work on a farm for the rest of your life. Let's also not forget smallpox, cholera, tuberculosis, typhoid fever, and dysentery. Basically, Oregon Trail wasn't exaggerating when it said you died of dysentery. People really did, constantly. But okay, maybe you're thinking, at least there were exciting shootouts, right? Not really. Gunfights were rare, and when they happened, they were messy and awkward. Nobody stood dramatically in the middle of town waiting for the clock to strike noon. That's a Hollywood invention. In reality, most violence was sudden, up close, and usually fueled by alcohol. The classic barroom brawl? Yeah, that happened. But it ended with someone falling face first into a spittoon, not with an epic duel under the desert sun. Guns themselves weren't even that reliable. Revolvers jammed, rifles misfired, and ammunition wasn't always easy to come by. If you've ever had your phone die at 3% battery, imagine that. But it's your weapon in the middle of a fight. Not ideal. And here's the kicker. Most people weren't even armed all the time. Towns like Dodge City actually banned carrying guns inside the city limits. People checked their weapons at the sheriff's office, kind of like coat check, but for revolvers. So if you were dreaming of a Wild West town where every man, woman, and child had 6 shooters at the ready, nope, sorry. Housing was another nightmare. If you were lucky, you got a log cabin. If you were unlucky, it was a sod house. For those unfamiliar, that's basically bricks made out of dirt and grass, stacked into walls. Yes, your house was literally made of mud. When it rained, the walls leaked. When it didn't rain, the dust got everywhere. Snakes loved moving into your walls too, which made bedtime exciting in all the worst ways. Furniture was minimal. Beds were lumpy straw mattresses, chairs were wooden planks. And if you wanted decoration, well, maybe you had a nice jug to display. Congratulations, you now own fine art. And then there's travel. Picture this. You want to go visit your cousin in the next town over. Today that might be a 40-minute drive. Back then, you're looking at a day-long ride on a horse or a bumpy stagecoach trip. Stagecoaches were basically wooden boxes on wheels that bounced so much your spine came out shorter at the end of the journey. If you weren't already car sick, you'd get coach sick pretty fast. And the roads? No roads. Just dirt tracks filled with rocks, holes, and the occasional rattlesnake. If it rained, mud would swallow your wagon wheels whole. If it didn't rain, the dust would coat every inch of your body until you looked like a breaded cutlet. Railroads existed, yes, but tickets were expensive, and trains were not exactly luxury travel. Coal smoke blew into the windows, cinders landed on your clothes, and the smell of unwashed passengers was persistent. So yeah, food was beans, water was poison, teeth were optional, baths were once a week if you were lucky, doctors didn't believe in germs, and your house was literally made of dirt. This was daily life in the Wild West. And we haven't even gotten to bandits, cattle drives, or the joys of frontier justice yet. But don't worry, we'll meander over there soon enough. For now, let's just sit with the image of you, a modern person with soft skin and a deep love for iced coffee, suddenly waking up in 1872 Dodge City. You've got no air conditioning, no running water, and your only entertainment is a banjo someone plays badly in the corner of a saloon. Still think you'd survive a day? So, we've established that life in the Wild West was basically one long camping trip you never signed up for. No showers, no snacks, no Netflix. Just beans, mud, and a slow march toward bad dentistry. But let's shuffle a little deeper into this dusty reality, because movies also love to glamorize a few more things. Bandits, cattle drives, and horses. And spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't enjoy any of them. Let's start with bandits. In popular imagination, the West was crawling with them. Black hats, masks, dramatic train robberies, Jesse James and Billy the Kid strutting around like celebrities. The truth? Yes, bandits existed, but not in the constant every 5 minutes way Hollywood wants you to believe. Robberies were relatively rare, and when they did happen, they were often sloppy, small-time affairs. Think less Ocean's 11 and more 2 guys falling off their horses halfway through the plan. But even if you weren't likely to get robbed daily, the fear was enough to keep people on edge. Imagine being in a rattly old stagecoach, bouncing over rocks, already covered in dust, and someone whispers that bandits have been spotted on this route. Suddenly, your whole ride is just sweaty paranoia. If you were unlucky enough to encounter a bandit, chances are they weren't glamorous outlaws. They were desperate, scrappy men, sometimes ex-soldiers from the Civil War, who needed cash fast. And they weren't dueling you in the street. They were holding you up at gunpoint, while you sat there calculating whether your boots were worth more than your life. And then there were train robberies. Yes, they happened, and yes, they were terrifying, but again, not frequent. And usually they were over in minutes. Nobody was standing on top of the train waving pistols while shouting dramatically. More often, a handful of men forced the conductor to stop, grabbed whatever bags of money were available, and ran, which is efficient, sure, but not exactly thrilling if you're the one getting robbed. Now let's mosey over to cattle drives, because if you weren't dealing with bandits, you were probably dealing with cows. Lots of cows. Cattle drives were basically the backbone of the Wild West economy. Picture thousands of cows being herded hundreds of miles, from Texas up to Kansas railheads, where they could be shipped east. Sounds simple, right? Wrong. It was chaos on four hooves. The romantic vision of the cowboy, sunset, silhouette against the horizon, guitar music playing. Well, strip that away. What you actually get is a bunch of underpaid teenagers riding horses all day, covered in dust, yelling at stubborn cows that don't want to move. Cattle drives took weeks, sometimes months. Days started at dawn and ended long after dark. Meals, beans again, shocker, sleeping arrangements, the ground, with bugs, lots of bugs, and the cows themselves were not cooperative. They spooked easily, they wandered off, they stepped on you if you weren't careful. Stampedes were a constant threat. Imagine thousands of pounds of beef suddenly deciding to sprint in the middle of the night. You'd be jolted awake, scrambling to control the chaos, praying you didn't get trampled flat. The pay? Pathetic. Cowboys weren't wealthy heroes. They were basically minimum wage workers of the 19th century. They made a few dollars a month, maybe enough to buy some new boots when their old ones fell apart. And for all that effort, they got the privilege of smelling like cow for the rest of their lives. Which brings us neatly to the next point. Horses. Because in the West, horses were essential. They were transportation, status symbols, and sometimes even your only real friend. Which sounds kind of sweet, until you remember horses also came with a mountain of problems. First off, horses were expensive. A decent one might cost the equivalent of several months' wages. And if your horse got sick or injured, congratulations, you're walking. And walking meant you were basically announcing to the world, "Hi, I'm vulnerable and poor. Please rob me." Second, horses were not comfortable. Riding for hours sounds cool in theory. In reality, your thighs and back would scream after about 30 minutes. Saddles rubbed you raw, stirrups cut into your legs, and bouncing around on rough trails gave you something charmingly called cowboy bow legs. By the end of a week, you'd basically be shaped like the letter O. And third, horses smelled. Oh, they smelled. Multiply that by entire towns filled with them, and you understand why every Wild West Main Street was basically a manure buffet. Add in the flies buzzing constantly, and you've got yourself a sensory experience you'll never forget, or want to. Let's also address alcohol, because it was basically the only form of entertainment most towns offered. Saloon culture was a huge part of the West. You've seen the movies, men at card tables, whiskey flowing, piano music tinkling away. But again, reality, a little less charming. Whiskey in the Wild West was often terrible quality. Sometimes it wasn't even whiskey at all. It was grain alcohol mixed with things like tobacco juice, gunpowder, or rattlesnake heads, because apparently poisoning your customers was just a casual pastime. People drank it anyway, because what else were they going to do? Read. Saloon games, meanwhile, were usually rigged. Professional gamblers followed cattle drives and railroad crews around, happily fleecing tired workers out of their pay. And yes, sometimes fights broke out. But they were messy, drunken brawls, not the stylish, choreographed saloon fights Hollywood loves to show off. Someone might throw a punch, someone else might fall through a chair, and at least one unlucky person always ended up in the spittoon. And the women in saloons? Yeah, let's just say life wasn't great for them either. Many worked as entertainers, waitresses, or sex workers, and conditions were rough. Disease spread quickly, pay was inconsistent, and respect from the local men was non-existent. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't romantic, it was survival. Now, let's wander back to the idea of law and order, because everyone loves to picture the Wild West as a place where sheriffs battled outlaws daily. The reality was bureaucratic. Yes, there were famous sheriffs like Wyatt Earp, but the majority of lawmen were more like small-town security guards. Their jobs involved paperwork, breaking up drunk fights, and occasionally chasing down stolen livestock. Not exactly thrilling. And jails, tiny, drafty, and often just one room with a lock. If the sheriff didn't feel like watching prisoners 24/7, sometimes he'd just let them out with a promise to come back for trial. Imagine today's justice system running on pinky swears. Trials, when they did happen, were often a mess. Juries were made up of whoever could be dragged in from the street, and verdicts depended less on evidence and more on who the locals liked better. Justice in the Wild West was basically 1 part law, 2 parts popularity contest. And if you were convicted, punishments ranged from fines to hanging. Yes, hanging happened. But despite what Hollywood wants you to think, public executions were not a daily spectacle. They were more like awkward community events where everyone stood around pretending this was normal, even though it was clearly horrifying. Let's drift now to fashion, because why not? Cowboys wore wide-brimmed hats, long coats, and boots. Sounds cool, right? Until you realize hats were mostly for blocking the sun, coats were for blocking dust, and boots were for blocking literal horse droppings. Basically, everything was functional first, stylish never. Women's fashion, meanwhile, was a nightmare. Bustles, corsets, long skirts dragging through mud and manure. Imagine trying to sweep your floor while wearing 5 pounds of fabric tied tightly around your ribs. Even in the middle of nowhere, society still expected women to dress like they were attending a tea party. So yes, people were passing out from heat stroke, but at least they looked respectable while doing it. And speaking of respectability, let's talk about churches. Religion was a major part of community life in the West, which meant Sundays were less day of rest and more sit in a stuffy wooden building for 3 hours while sweating in wool clothing. Ministers were often stern, sermons were long, and the pews were just hard planks. Not exactly a soothing way to spend your only day off. But churches also doubled as community centers. Town dances, meetings, and even school lessons often happened there. So whether you wanted to or not, you were going. Social pressure was strong, and skipping church could basically brand you as that weird neighbor. And trust me, in a town of 50 people, you did not want that reputation. So let's recap what we've drifted through tonight. Bandits were rare, but scary when they appeared. Cattle drives were long, exhausting, and smelled like cow. Horses were useful, but painful, expensive, and smelly. Saloons were less glamorous drinking halls and more depressing toxin dispensers. Sheriffs mostly did paperwork, not epic showdowns. Fashion was torture disguised as clothing, and church was your main form of weekend entertainment. Does this sound like the land of adventure and excitement? Or does it sound like a dusty, exhausting, smelly place where every day felt like a mild endurance test? Exactly. So next time someone tells you they'd love to live in the Wild West, gently remind them they'd be broke, dirty, sunburnt, and eating beans for the third meal in a row. Oh, and probably sleeping in a dirt house with snakes in the walls. But don't worry, we're not done yet. Because next, we'll float over to the real nightmare fuel of the frontier: diseases, disasters, and the sheer joy of being hundreds of miles from the nearest doctor. So settle in, take a sip of your very clean modern water, and be glad you weren't born into a sod house in 1870. So far, we've talked about beans, bandits, and the fine art of smelling like a horse. But honestly, the real killer of the Wild West wasn't guns or cattle stampedes. It was basically everything else. The West was a buffet of hazards, from diseases to disasters, with a side dish of medical treatments that were almost worse than the illness itself. Let's start with everyone's favorite, disease. Imagine this. You wake up in your sod house one morning. You're itchy, your neighbor's coughing, and the water from the well tastes like rusty nails. Congratulations, you're probably sick. Smallpox was a big one. Entire communities were devastated by outbreaks. Vaccines technically existed, but they weren't widely available, and sometimes they were handled so badly that people got sick from the vaccine itself. So it was kind of a gamble. Like, do you want the disease now or later? Then there was tuberculosis, the infamous consumption. People coughed, wasted away slowly, and everyone in town just accepted it as part of life. If your neighbor was hacking up blood, you didn't call the CDC. You shrugged, closed the window, and hoped you weren't next. Cholera and typhoid fever also loved the West, thanks to questionable water supplies. Remember, most towns didn't have plumbing. Wells and rivers doubled as both water sources and sewage systems. If you think that's gross, you're right. But hey, at least you got used to the taste of mud and bacteria in your morning drink. And of course, dysentery, the ultimate Oregon Trail classic. People laugh about it now, but back then, it killed thousands. You'd be traveling in a wagon train, feeling fine one minute, and then, nope. Suddenly, your entire trip ended in a very undignified way. So, when you inevitably got sick, what did the doctors of the Wild West do for you? Well, brace yourself. Medical science in the 1800s was a mix of old wives' tales, medieval guesswork, and the occasional correct idea that nobody trusted yet. Germ theory was only just gaining ground. Many doctors thought disease came from bad air, so treatments often focused on fresh breezes, which sure sounds pleasant, but wasn't exactly a cure. Bleeding was still popular. If you had a fever, doctors might cut you open and let blood out, because obviously losing fluids will fix everything. And if bleeding didn't help, they might try blistering. That meant burning or chemically irritating your skin to draw out bad humors. Basically, torture disguised as medicine. And let's not forget mercury. Yes, doctors prescribed actual mercury for syphilis, stomach problems, you name it. The problem? Mercury is poisonous. Patients sometimes got sicker from the treatment than from the disease itself. But hey, at least their doctor tried something. Surgery existed, but anesthesia was primitive. Chloroform and ether were sometimes used, but not always available. And antiseptics? Rarely. So if you needed an operation, your odds of dying from infection were almost higher than from the original injury. Imagine getting a broken arm set by someone with unwashed hands holding pliers that were just used on the last patient. sweet dreams. Dentistry, meanwhile, was still basically medieval. Toothaches meant extractions. Tools were simple, painkillers were minimal, and the process often ended with you fainting. If you've ever complained about waiting 2 weeks for a dentist appointment, just remember, in the Wild West, the appointment was immediate, and the dentist was also the town barber. Multitasking at its finest. As if germs weren't enough, nature itself seemed determined to wipe settlers off the map. Let's float over to prairie fires. The Great Plains had endless grasslands, and dry grass loves to burn. One spark, from lightning, a campfire, even a passing train, could ignite a firestorm that spread for miles. Imagine walls of flame racing across the horizon, faster than you could run, with smoke choking the air. Entire farms disappeared overnight. Settlers fought fires with buckets of water, wet blankets, or, if they were desperate, just plowing lines of dirt to stop the spread. But most of the time, it was hopeless. You watched your hard work go up in smoke and hoped you at least saved the family cow. Then there were dust storms. Without trees to anchor the soil, winds whipped up massive clouds of dirt that blotted out the sun. Breathing was nearly impossible. Settlers stuffed rags under doors and windows, but dust still coated every surface. Imagine eating a stew that crunches with every bite because dust managed to sneak in. Delicious. Floods and droughts also tag-teamed settlers. One season your house floated away, the next your crops shriveled into nothing. There was never a middle ground. It was like Mother Nature just enjoyed watching humans suffer, and of course, locusts. Again. Because one wave of grasshoppers wasn't enough. They ate crops, fences, clothes, pretty much anything not nailed down. Some settlers reported waking up to find locusts chewing on their sheets while they were still in bed. Cozy. Winter wasn't much kinder. The West had brutal blizzards, especially up north. Temperatures plummeted, snow buried towns, and fuel was scarce. If you didn't chop enough wood in the fall, you risked freezing before spring. And chopping wood wasn't exactly a quick, cozy activity. It was exhausting, dangerous, and required you to spend hours outside in the very cold you were trying to avoid. Meanwhile, food supplies ran low. Settlers sometimes resorted to eating whatever was left. Old bread, dried beans, even livestock feed. Imagine a Christmas dinner of stale cornmeal and sadness. And we can't forget accidents, because if the diseases, disasters, and starvation didn't get you, the daily chores might. Chopping wood? One slip of the axe and suddenly you needed that barber-dentist-surgeon to sew you up. Herding cattle? Congratulations, you've just been kicked in the ribs. Riding a horse? Broken bones galore. Handling firearms? Misfires were common, and not everyone survived their own clumsiness. Even laundry was dangerous. Women often boiled clothes in huge pots over open fires. One wrong move, and burns were inevitable. So yes, even clean socks came with mortal risk. Now, let's briefly wander back to childbirth, because it really deserves its own spotlight in the Wild West Hall of Horrors. Pregnancy was risky everywhere in the 1800s, but especially on the frontier, where midwives were few and doctors even fewer. Women often gave birth at home, with only family to help. Complications like breech births or hemorrhaging were often fatal. Infant mortality rates were staggering. Sometimes a third of babies didn't survive their first year. Families coped by having more kids. Which sounds practical, until you realize each pregnancy came with the same life or death stakes. And so families lived in this constant cycle of grief, survival, and trying again. Not exactly the cheery wagon train adventure school textbooks once promised. You might be thinking, okay, but surely people adapted. They got tougher, right? Well, yes and no. Settlers did adapt. They built communities, they supported one another, and they somehow pushed through. But toughness had limits. Plenty of people packed up and left. Some went back east. Some drifted from town to town, chasing work or luck. And many simply didn't make it. The high death rate in Western cemeteries tells the story best. Headstones often listed people who died in their 20s, 30s, or 40s. Old age was rare. If you lived past 50, you were basically considered ancient. And if you reached 70, congratulations, you were a living legend, probably held together by beans and spite. So let's take a moment to imagine you, again, magically dropped into the Wild West. Day 1. You're already sunburned. Your water tastes like dirt. Day 2. You're covered in dust, and your horse hates you. Day 3. You've got a toothache, the barber dentist is sharpening his pliers, and your neighbor just invited you to church in a room hotter than the inside of a bread oven. By the end of the week, you're either sick, broke, or both. And that's before the prairie catches fire. So yeah, disease was everywhere. Medicine was terrifying. Disasters struck constantly. The Wild West wasn't glamorous, it wasn't exciting. It was, frankly, exhausting. But don't fall asleep just yet. We've still got more slow misery to stroll through. Next, we'll drift into the social side of the West. The weird rules, the community gossip, and the constant struggle of trying to look respectable while living in what was basically one big mud pit. So, take a breath. Be grateful for your thermostat. And let's keep meandering through history's least comfortable camping trip. So far, we've covered food that was mostly beans, medicine that was mostly poison, and weather that seemed actively out to kill you. But survival in the Wild West wasn't just about not dying of dysentery. It was also about surviving other people. Because as much as Hollywood loves the lone cowboy riding into the sunset, the reality is that most folks in the West lived in small, gossipy, tight-knit communities. And if you've ever lived in a small town, you already know. Privacy was not a thing. Let's picture a typical frontier town. Maybe a couple hundred people, a few wooden buildings, one saloon, one church, a general store, and a scattering of sod houses and log cabins. Everyone knows everyone else's business because there's literally nothing else to do. And in that environment, reputation was everything. You didn't want to be the person who skipped church, or the guy who lost his cow, or worse, the woman people whisper about. One slip, one rumor, and suddenly you're the star of the town's unofficial gossip mill. Take women, for example. Life was already tough, but add the social rules, and it got tougher. You were expected to keep house, raise kids, dress respectably, and attend church. Step outside that mold, and eyebrows went up. Divorce? Scandalous. Living alone? Suspicious. Laughing too loudly in public? Questionable. Basically, if you weren't a saint, you were a cautionary tale. Men didn't escape the gossip either. If you couldn't keep a steady job, or your cattle drive failed, or you drank too much at the saloon, which, let's be honest, everyone did, people noticed, and they remembered. Years later, you could still be that guy who lost all his money in a card game. The West might have been physically huge, but socially, it was as small and suffocating as a one-room schoolhouse. Speaking of schoolhouses, education on the frontier was creative. Some towns had schools, often one-room buildings where one teacher handled every grade level. Kids aged 6 to 16 sat side by side, trying to learn the basics while chickens occasionally wandered in through the door. Supplies were scarce. Chalk, paper, even books were luxuries. Teachers often had to improvise, drilling students on memorization and recitation instead of handing out worksheets. And discipline? Let's just say rulers weren't only for measuring. Attendance was spotty too. During planting or harvest seasons, kids stayed home to help on the farm. So an education might mean a few months a year, at best. If you managed to learn to read and write before adulthood, you were doing better than many. And yet, despite the difficulties, education was prized. Parents scraped together money to pay teachers, and communities bragged about having a schoolhouse as a sign of respectability. Because again, reputation mattered. Now let's drift back to entertainment, since life wasn't all work and survival. What did people actually do for fun, besides drink questionable whiskey and gossip about their neighbors? Well, dances were popular. The church or town hall might host them, and everyone showed up. Fiddles played, couples danced, and for one night, people could almost forget the mud and the locusts. These dances were also prime matchmaking opportunities, which sounds sweet until you realize half the couples married after knowing each other for about 3 weeks. Options were limited, okay? Singing around the fire was also common, as was storytelling. Remember, no TV, no radio. Just people sitting around swapping tales, sometimes exaggerated to the point of absurdity. If you've ever heard the phrase tall tale, that's where it comes from. Paul Bunyan, Pecos Bill, all those larger-than-life characters, they started as bored settlers, entertaining each other. Reading was a luxury, but when books or newspapers made their way west, they were treasured. Families might read the same few stories over and over, passing them down through generations. Imagine being so desperate for entertainment that you memorized an 1840s newspaper article about corn prices and recited it for fun. That was life. Religion, as mentioned earlier, doubled as entertainment too. Revival meetings were huge social events. Traveling preachers set up tents, drew crowds from miles around, and delivered fiery sermons designed to keep people awake for hours. For communities starved of novelty, this was the 19th century equivalent of a Netflix special. And don't forget holidays. Christmas and 4th of July were celebrated with as much enthusiasm as possible, usually a mix of church services, feasts, and homemade decorations. Fireworks were rare, but if someone managed to get them, the whole town turned out. Because again, there just wasn't much else to do. But underneath all this entertainment was a constant tug-of-war between respectability and survival. For instance, gambling was technically frowned upon, but saloons ran card games anyway. Prostitution was condemned from the pulpit, but it quietly kept many frontier towns afloat. Drinking was a problem, but banning alcohol rarely worked. Towns tried to present themselves as orderly, decent communities, while everyone secretly bent the rules just to get by. It was like living in high school forever. A small group of authority figures tried to enforce rules, while everyone else whispered, bent them, or ignored them. And no matter what, gossip traveled faster than the stagecoach. Let's talk about marriage, because that's where things got especially interesting. On the frontier, the ratio of men to women was wildly unbalanced. In some areas, it was 10-1, which meant women had options, but also pressure. Many married young, sometimes in their teens, because single women were magnets for gossip and unwanted attention. Men, meanwhile, often struggled to find wives at all. Some sent for mail-order brides, Women from back east who agreed to marry strangers in exchange for a ticket west. Romantic, right? Well, not always. Sometimes it worked out, but sometimes it ended in disappointment, disaster, or desertion. Imagine waiting months for your new spouse to arrive, only to discover you can't stand each other. And divorce wasn't exactly simple. Widowhood was also common. With so many accidents, diseases, and disasters, plenty of women lost husbands early. And in the West, remarriage often followed quickly, not out of love, but necessity. Running a farm or raising children alone was nearly impossible, so the line between romance and practicality was blurry at best. Children, of course, were part of this social fabric, and their lives were far from carefree. Kids were expected to work early, feeding animals, fetching water, helping with crops. Toys were simple: rag dolls, wooden horses, maybe a homemade ball. Entertainment came from imagination, chores, and occasionally whacking each other with sticks. Education, as we said, was hit or miss. Many kids grew up barely literate, but extremely skilled at practical tasks. They could harness a horse or milk a cow long before they could write a paragraph, which honestly made sense for survival. Childhood illnesses were rampant, though. Measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough, they swept through towns and claimed young lives regularly. Families often lost multiple children, and grief was an everyday reality. Life was cheap, and resilience was expected, which is depressing, but very on-brand for the Wild West. So, let's do another cozy recap. Communities were tiny, nosy, and obsessed with reputation. Schools were one-room chaos pits with more chickens than textbooks. Entertainment was mostly gossip, dancing, and tall tales. Religion doubled as both spiritual guidance and weekend Netflix. Marriage was rushed. Widowhood was common, and romance often meant, well, it'll do. Children worked like adults and survived childhood illnesses if they were lucky. Not exactly the glamorous cowboy adventure we've been sold, right? More like a never-ending PTA meeting mixed with camping in a dust storm. But don't doze off yet. We've still got more ground to cover. Next, we'll mosey into the economic side of the Wild West. Money, mining, land grabs, and why most people ended up broke no matter how hard they worked. So take a sip of your clean water, adjust your comfortable blanket, and be very, very grateful you're not haggling over beans in a mud-covered general store right now.